Today we have a really cool video for you guys. It'll be a collection of 4 stories that are all fan favorites, and they all share a theme: park ranger stories. Story 1: Ranger Danger. We just wanted a peaceful getaway, but I think this park ranger wants me dead. The last thing Dana remembered before the sun came up was the ranger's silhouette standing at the edge of the tree line, not moving, not speaking, just watching their tent for what had already been 3 hours. Here's how they got there. Dana and her boyfriend Marcus had driven 6 hours to get to Pinecrest Hollow State Park. Not the famous kind. Not the kind with gift shops and shuttle buses. The kind with a single gravel road in, a rusted gate you had to open yourself, and a trail map printed in 1987 that was already faded when you picked it up from the ranger station. That should have been sign enough. But the photos online made it look like something from a dream. Mossy ravines, a creek that bent around a sandbar, canopy so thick the light came through in columns. They arrived Thursday. The ranger station was technically open. A single truck sat out front, white, dented along the rear panel, a yellow light bar mounted on the roof that looked like it hadn't worked since the Clinton administration. The ranger inside barely looked up when they signed in. Late 40s, thick neck, hands that seemed too large for the pen he was holding. His name tag said Coyle. He asked how long they planned to stay. Marcus said 3 nights. Coyle wrote that down. Then he asked something Marcus thought was strange. He asked if anyone knew they were coming. Marcus said yes, sure, people know. Coyle nodded slowly and slid their permit back across the counter without another word. They found their site around 4 in the afternoon. Site 7, which the map said was the farthest from the road, it was perfect, completely secluded, creek audible but not visible. They set up the tent, got a fire going, ate well, went to sleep early. Dana woke at 2 in the morning. Not gradually, the kind of waking where your eyes open and your body is already rigid because something inside you processed the wrongness before your brain caught up. There were footsteps outside the tent. Slow, measured, circling, not the skitter of an animal, not a branch dropping. Deliberate weight on dry leaves, moving in a slow orbit around the tent's perimeter. She touched Marcus's arm. He was already awake. Neither of them spoke. They lay still, listening to the footsteps slow, then stop, right outside the tent door. The zipper rattled once barely, and then went still. In the morning, there was nothing. No footprints in the soft mud near the creek bank that they could identify as human, no sign of disturbance. Marcus told her it was probably a deer. Dana had grown up near forests. She knew what deer sounded like. That was not a deer. They stayed the second night because Marcus was stubborn and Dana didn't want to feel like she was being dramatic. They rearranged their site, parked closer to the main trail, kept the lantern on. Around 9 in the evening, Ranger Coyle appeared. He walked into their campsite without announcing himself, just materialized at the edge of the firelight, in full uniform, hands on his belt. Said he was just doing his rounds. Asked if everything was comfortable. Marcus offered him coffee. Coyle declined, but didn't leave. He stood there for 10, maybe 12 minutes, answering their small talk in monosyllables, scanning the tree line instead of looking at them. Before he left, he said something that neither Dana nor Marcus could properly explain later. He said, "You should know, Site 7 gets a lot of animal activity at night. I'd recommend staying inside the tent once it gets dark. Don't come out for any sounds you hear. Not for any sounds." He walked back into the darkness. The crunch of his footsteps faded. Then they heard, very faintly, what sounded like a second pair of footsteps somewhere behind the trees, slightly off rhythm from his, as though walking parallel. Neither of them mentioned the second sound out loud that night. The third night, their last night, they made a plan. Marcus set a small wireless camera they'd originally packed for wildlife photography, angling it toward the tent from a tree about 15 feet away. They went to sleep at 10. Dana set an alarm for 2. At 2:14, she checked the camera feed on her phone. Ranger Coyle was standing at the boundary of the campsite, not moving. He had been there, according to the motion-activated timestamps, since 11:47. She woke Marcus, they watched the feed together. Coyle did not move. He stood at the edge of the firelight's reach, arms at his sides, facing the tent. For 2 hours and 11 minutes, according to the timestamps, he did not shift his weight, did not reach for his radio, did not look away. At 4:06, he turned and walked back into the trees. Dana and Marcus were in the car by 4:15. They did not pack the tent properly. They left the camp chair. They drove out on the gravel road with the headlights off for the first quarter mile because Dana was certain that turning the lights on would confirm to whatever was watching that they were leaving, and she did not want to give whatever was in those trees time to move to intercept them. They filed a report with the county sheriff's office the following morning, along with the camera footage. A deputy reviewed it and said it appeared to show a park employee conducting what could have been a welfare check, that the ranger had every right to monitor campsites. That standing near a site was not technically a crime. Dana asked the deputy if he thought it was normal for a park ranger to stand motionless for over 2 hours in the middle of the night while watching sleeping campers. The deputy looked at the footage again. He didn't answer, he just told them he'd look into it. They never heard back. They looked up Coyle's name afterward. There were 2 complaints filed against him in the county system, both from campers at Pinecrest Hollow. Both listed under the same category: unsettling conduct. Both marked closed. No action taken. The most recent complaint was filed 14 months ago. The camper who filed it had gone back to Site 7. The details aren't public. What was public, buried in a local Facebook group for the county, was a comment from someone who claimed to be the camper's sister, written 3 weeks after the complaint was filed. She wrote, "He was the only one who came back. Dana still doesn't know what that means. She thinks about it every time she sees a truck with a yellow light bar. She thinks about that second pair of footsteps. She thinks about how Coyle didn't ask them for their names when they signed in. He asked if anyone knew they were coming. There's a difference between those 2 questions." She didn't understand the difference until they were already 3 hours from home, watching the sun come up in the rearview mirror. Story 2. I'm a new ranger for the U.S. Forest Service, and I'm nervous about some strange things that have been going on lately. The last thing I expected on my 3rd week on the job was to find a campfire still burning at 2 in the mine. Morning, 2 miles from the nearest trail, with a folding chair set up in front of it and absolutely no one around. Here's how I ended up standing there. I got hired by the U.S. Forest Service in the spring. Seasonal position, Olympic National Forest, Washington State. I was 26, fresh out of a natural resources program, excited about the work. Trail maintenance, campsite inspection, visitor education, the occasional wildlife report. I wasn't prepared for any of what actually happened. The first 2 weeks were fine. I shadowed a senior ranger named Gretchen who'd been working the sector for 11 years. She was methodical, cheerful, knew every tree by species. She told me the forest was calm right now. She used the word now in a way that made me want to ask what she meant. I didn't, yet. My 3rd week, Gretchen went on scheduled leave. I worked solo. Night patrol started at 10 and ran until 6. My sector covered roughly 40 square miles of mixed-use forest, which sounds manageable until you're actually in it in the dark and realize that 40 square miles is a very particular kind of infinite. First night alone, nothing happened. I logged mileage, checked 4 campsites, found a bear canister someone had abandoned and noted it for retrieval, normal. Second night, I found footprints on a closed trail. The trail had been gated for 3 weeks due to a washout. The lock on the gate was intact, the prints were on the far side of the gate, in the mud beside the trail, and they led deeper in. They did not come back out. I logged it. Assumed a climber had gone around the gate. Probably nothing. Third night, the fire. I was doing a sweep of the backcountry boundary when I caught the smell of wood smoke. Not unusual, except I was at least 2 miles from any designated campsite, the nearest trailhead was closed for maintenance, and I hadn't seen a single registered permit for this zone in 2 days. I followed the smell. It took about 20 minutes. I came over a ridge and saw the fire below in a small clearing, burning steadily, not out of control, well tended. A folding camp chair sat in front of it, angled toward the flames. A metal cup sat in the dirt beside the chair. I called out. No response. I descended into the clearing. The cup still had coffee in it. Still warm. The fire was maybe an hour old based on the coal structure. Whoever had been sitting in that chair had left or been taken away very recently. I radioed in, got back a response asking me to flag the location and continue patrol. I did. When I came back through that same ridge 40 minutes later, the fire had been put out. Not burned down, put out, stamped, by the look of the ash scatter, and the chair was gone. The cup was gone. I told Gretchen when she returned. She listened without interrupting. Then she asked me which sector of the backcountry. When I told her, she was quiet for a moment. She said, "That's the boundary zone. We don't patrol in there after midnight." I asked her why. She said the area had irregular wildlife patterns. She said the last ranger who'd regularly patrolled that zone had requested a reassignment. She said it was noted in the sector file. Then she said something she immediately walked back, like she'd said it before, thinking. She said, "You don't want to be the one who finds out what's doing the camp setup." She changed the subject. I let it go, because I was 3 weeks into my first real job and I still needed to prove something to myself. But the camp setup kept happening. Over the next 6 weeks, I found 4 more. All in the boundary zone, all abandoned, all recently used. Fires, chairs, sometimes a second chair. Once, a sleeping bag that had been laid out but not slept in, still rolled inside out the way you'd unroll it to air it, but spread flat on the ground, empty. I started keeping my own log, separate from the official one, dates, coordinates, details. After the 5th incident, I mapped the locations. They formed a loose pattern, moving roughly northeast, 300 to 500 meters between each site, as if something was making camp and then relocating on a schedule. Then I found the photograph. It was the 7th week. I was checking one of the sites in the boundary zone, and I found a standard printed photograph, laminated, pinned to a tree with a wooden spike. The photo was of a campfire. Just a campfire, burning in a clearing at night. I turned it over. On the back, in small, neat handwriting, was a date, 3 years ago, and below it, 2 words, still here. I submitted the photograph to the district office. I never heard back about it. But the week after I submitted it, my sector file had a new notation I didn't put there. In the boundary zone, someone had added a one-line note to the restricted activity log. It said, "Do not follow the camp. No author, no date, no explanation. Gretchen retired at the end of the season." On her last day, she left a sticky note on my locker. All it said was, "Don't ask what it's doing there. That's what it wants you to ask. I still work there." The camps still appear. I log them in my private file and I do not follow them northeast. But I think about that photograph. I think about the date on the back, 3 years before I arrived, and someone already knew to write, "Still here." Last week, I found a new site. Same clearing structure, same fire, same 2 chairs. There was a third chair this time. It was facing the other two. Story 3. I was a law enforcement ranger for a secret national park. This is what I can tell you about its unique wildlife. The last thing I was told before my first solo patrol was that the only rule that actually mattered was this one. If something in the park looks at you first, you are already out of time. Here's what I can tell you about the place. It doesn't have a name you'd recognize. It doesn't appear on any public map. The NPS designation for it internally is something bureaucratic and forgettable, a string of letters and numbers that tells you nothing about the place itself. What it is, technically, is a federally protected research zone located in a mountain corridor in the northern Rockies, and the cover designation is a wilderness study area. The kind that shows up on satellite maps as undifferentiated green, the kind that doesn't have a visitor center or a trailhead or a park store, the kind where the gate has no sign and the road in is unpaved, and the only people who go there are the ones who are supposed to be there. I was hired through a separate application process than standard NPS positions. Background check that went back further than most federal jobs. A psychological evaluation with questions that seemed strange at the time, questions about how I respond to prolonged uncertainty, whether I have strong pattern recognition instincts, whether I believe in phenomena that resist conventional explanation. I answered those honestly. Apparently, that was the right move. I was briefed on the park's wildlife profile before my first week. The briefing had 2 sections. The first section was standard. Black bears, mountain lions, elk, wolf pack activity in the northern range, raptor corridors, the usual. Fine. I'd worked with all of it. The second section was marked with a different header, not unusual species, not even unclassified. The header was a single word, residents. The briefing described 7 categories of residents. I'm going to tell you about 3, because the other 4 fall under a non-disclosure provision I still technically respect, and because the 3 I'm describing are the ones most relevant to understanding why the park exists in the first place. The first category, mimics. These are entities that replicate auditory signatures of wildlife, bird calls, elk vocalizations, in some documented cases, human voices with a fidelity that is not achievable by any known animal. They have been recorded. The recordings are on file. The purpose of the mimicry, if there is a purpose beyond instinct, is not understood. The primary hazard, they can draw a ranger toward terrain that is inaccessible or dangerous following what sounds like a distress call. The protocol is to log the vocalization, mark the coordinates, and do not approach. You will feel compelled to approach. That is part of the mechanism. Do not. The second category, imprinters. These entities don't produce sound. They produce visual signatures, silhouettes at tree line, shadows that don't correspond to a light source. Occasionally, a shape at significant distance that your eye registers as human, but that does not move with human gait or proportion. They have been photographed. Again, on file. The hazard is not the visual itself. The hazard is that sustained visual contact, more than approximately 90 seconds, according to the briefing, produces measurable cognitive effects in human observers. Disorientation, time distortion. In 2 documented cases, an inability to accurately describe one's own location for up to 4 hours afterward. The protocol, look away within 60 seconds of first sighting. Write down the time and coordinates before you look away, while you still can. The third category is the one I don't sleep well thinking about. The briefing called them scaffolds. Physical structures found in the deep interior, that are not naturally occurring and are not attributable to any human activity, historical or contemporary. The briefing was careful with language here. It said the structures are not built in any recognizable sense. It said they appear to organize according to a logic that has not been decoded. It said the structures grow, that was the word used, grow at a rate that has been measured across 3 decades of surveillance. I found a scaffold in my 4th month, came across it in a canyon basin I was surveying after a storm had altered the drainage. It was about 12 feet tall, constructed from what appeared to be dry branches, elk antler segments, and stones in a lattice arrangement that had no obvious structural purpose. No human tool marks on any component, no tracks around its base. It was clearly new. The mud at the base was disturbed and then reset, as if the ground itself had adjusted. I stood at the minimum safe distance described in the briefing, 100 meters, and took photographs. I logged it. When I returned the following week, it was 30 centimeters taller. The thing about working that park is that you are never certain what falls into the category of explainable and what doesn't. The mimics could theoretically be an undocumented species with unusual vocal anatomy. The imprinters could be a documented perceptual phenomenon related to altitude and light diffusion. The scaffolds could, in theory, be constructed by an entity we simply haven't identified yet. But there's a detail from my last year there that I keep coming back to. In the canyon basin near the scaffold site, I found a photograph similar to one I'd heard another ranger describe from a different sector, printed, laminated, pinned to a tree. The photograph showed the scaffold the exact one I was standing near, but smaller, perhaps a third of its current height. The date on the back of the photograph was 41 years ago. In the corner of the photograph, barely visible at the tree line, was a shape. It was looking at the camera. That was the moment I understood what the briefing meant when it said, "If something in the park looks at you first, you are already out of time." Because that photograph was 41 years old. And whatever was in the tree line in that image, it had been watching that scaffold grow for decades before I ever arrived. It already knew I was coming. Story 4. I worked as a park ranger in Alaska. There were inhuman things living in the vast wilderness. The last thing my supervisor said to me before my first solo winter patrol was, "If you see tracks that start in the middle of a field with no trail leading in, walk away and file the report from the truck." Here's why that mattered. Alaska is not like other wilderness. I don't mean that in a scenic way, though it's that too. I mean it in a structural way. The distances between human presence and genuine remoteness in Alaska are measured differently than anywhere else I've worked. You can drive 4 hours from Anchorage in any direction and be somewhere that has not been physically visited by a human being in living memory. Not because it's inaccessible, because there's simply no reason for anyone to go there. No trail, no summit, no fishing spot notable enough to draw attention, just land, and whatever lives in it undisturbed. I was stationed at a ranger district that administered about 2.5 million acres of national forest. My patrol sector was the northeastern quadrant. Roughly 800,000 acres of boreal forest, glacier margin, and what the topographic maps labeled simply as mixed terrain. I had a partner for the first season, a ranger named Bev, who'd worked Alaska for 9 years. She taught me the work. She also taught me the things that weren't in any training manual. The first lesson, don't use a headlamp in the deep interior after 10 at night. Not because of visibility, because of what the light attracts. She never fully explained that. She said she'd learned it the hard way. I accepted it. The second lesson, when you hear something mimicking an animal call, but the timing is off slightly too late, slightly too loud, slightly too precise, stop moving immediately. Mark your location. Breathe. Give it 60 seconds of silence. If the call repeats, you are being observed. Move toward the nearest open ground and do not stop until you're in a clearance wide enough to see the tree line in all directions. I used that protocol 4 times in 2 years. The 5th time was the incident I'm going to tell you about. It was February. Light was short and the temperature was sitting at -18 when I went out for a welfare check on a hunting party that had been reported overdue by their outfitter. 2 men, experienced, proper gear, registered with our office. Their last known position was a camp near a frozen drainage creek about 12 miles from the nearest road. I found the camp. Tents intact, gear organized, nothing disturbed in any way that suggested an emergency or an exit. The fire pit had been used recently, their packs were still there, their rifles were still there. One pair of boots was by the tent door. Someone had left the camp recently without their boots, in -18. I called it in and started a track from the camp perimeter. The tracks in the snow from the boots, or rather, the absence of them, was the thing that stopped me. I found footprints in the snow leading away from camp toward the tree line. Human gait, human size. I followed them 15 meters, and then they stopped. Not gradually, the way tracks diminish in wind-blown snow, they stopped, mid-stride, right foot forward, heel planted, toes pressing down, and then nothing. No second track in front of it, no disturbance in the snow on either side, no compression from a jump. Just the track, ending, as if the person who made it had ceased to exist between one step and the next. I marked the location. I did not follow further. I called in the coordinates. I moved to open ground. Bev arrived 2 hours later with a search team. The hunters were found 6 miles west, hypothermic but alive, in a condition none of them could explain. They had no memory of leaving camp. Both said the last thing either could recall was hearing something outside the tent that sounded like the other one calling their name, but from far away, further than should have been possible. Both had gone out separately to check on the other. Neither had told the other they were going. The third member of the party had not been with them. We found him the following morning, 2 miles north, unharmed, sitting against a tree. He was entirely calm. He said he'd been there since the previous night. He said something had stood at the edge of the firelight and spoken to him in a language he didn't recognize, and he hadn't felt afraid, and he'd followed it, and then he was sitting against the tree, and he didn't remember the distance in between. He said, "It was trying to tell me something. I think it wanted me to understand." He left Alaska the following week. I don't know if he ever tried to find out what it was saying. I worked 3 more seasons. The incidents accumulated. Tracks that started without origin, vocalizations that responded to radio signals with uncanny precision, as if rebroadcasting them. Once, a structure of bones and stone on a ridgeline that matched no known cultural or practical construction I'd ever seen, and that the wildlife biologist we brought in refused to include in her report because, she said, including it would require her to explain it, and she couldn't. The last thing I found, on my final week before transferring south, was a set of tracks on a frozen lake bed, human-sized, running. They ran in a straight line for 400 meters and then stopped. In the center of the track, termination was a single handprint in the snow, palm down, fingers spread, as if someone had knelt and placed their hand there deliberately. The handprint had 6 fingers. I filed the report, I transferred, I have not been back. I still think about the hunter who sat under that tree and said he thought it was trying to communicate. I think about the calm on his face when he said it. I think about the fact that he wasn't afraid. And I wonder sometimes whether that was the most frightening part, that whatever lives out there in those 800,000 acres isn't threatening us, it's patient with us. It's waiting for us to understand something we're not equipped to understand yet. I'm not sure which scenario is worse. Story 5. I'm a park ranger at Mount Rainier. People keep going missing, and I think I found out why. The last thing the missing hiker's husband said to the search coordinator before we called off the second day of searching was she wouldn't have gone off the trail. She was afraid of the dark. She would never have gone into the trees at night. It was 11 in the morning when he said that. Broad daylight, clear skies. She'd been missing for 31 hours. Here's what I know. Mount Rainier is a 14,000-foot active stratovolcano surrounded by 236,000 acres of protected wilderness. From a distance, it's the kind of beauty that makes people emotional. Up close, inside the backcountry, it is something else. The glaciers groan at night. The trails at elevation lose definition and cloud cover in under 20 minutes. The tree line sits at a specific altitude where the forest becomes dense and the trails narrow, and the weather patterns around the mountain create microclimates that can shift visibility from a mile to 30 feet without warning. People go missing at Rainier, more than the public record suggests. Not all of them are found. The ones who are found are sometimes found in places that don't make sense, given their last known position uphill from where they went missing, off-trail and terrain, that experienced hikers would have avoided. In 2 cases during my 7 years there, the recovered hikers had no memory of how they'd arrived at the location where they were found. I started keeping a personal file in my 4th year. Not because anyone told me to. Because I was beginning to see a pattern that the official incident reports weren't capturing. The missing persons events at Rainier were clustering. Not randomly distributed across the park, not correlated with weather events or trail difficulty. They were clustering around a specific elevation band, 4,100 to 4,800 feet, on the northeast face. Inside that band, there are 4 trail segments that see regular hiker traffic. Over 6 years of my own records, 14 of the 17 most significant missing persons incidents had originated within that elevation band. 12 of those 14 on the northeast face specifically. The northeast face has a feature that doesn't appear on standard trail maps. It's a depression in the terrain, not a crater, not a drainage, just a broad, shallow bowl about 300 meters across, densely forested, sitting at the intersection of two old game trails that were de-designated in the 1990s. The bowl is not on any route. There's no reason for a hiker to go there. I started surveying it. The first survey, I found nothing. The second, nothing. The third survey, in early October, I found a cache of objects at the center of the bowl, arranged in a rough circle pressed into the moss. 7 watches. Different brands, different styles, all stopped at different times, all corroded as if long exposed to moisture. I photographed them, I reported them, they were logged as found personal property probable hiker loss cache and entered into the property storage system. No follow-up. I cross-referenced the watch brands with missing persons reports going back to 1,998. 3 were identifiable. 2 of those 3 had belonged to individuals who were listed as missing and never recovered. The property recovery dates in the system were listed as the date I found them, but when I pulled the original property intake forms, 2 of the watches had been found previously, years earlier, by a different ranger, and quietly removed from the missing persons evidence files and recategorized as general found property. The reclassification had been done administratively, with no explanation in the record. I brought this to my sector supervisor. He listened. He told me the reclassification was probably an administrative error, that found property protocols had changed over the years, and that I shouldn't read patterns into administrative inconsistencies. He said it in the tone people use when they want you to stop asking. 2 weeks later, I went back to the bowl. The watches were gone. Not collected by the property team I checked, they were simply no longer there. The moss still showed the impression circles where they'd been. In the center of where they'd been arranged, there was a new object. A single watch stopped at 347, still in the depression circle by itself, as if placed there after everything else had been removed. I recognized the watch. I'd seen a photograph of it in the missing persons file of the woman who'd gone missing 31 hours before the one whose husband said she would never have gone into the trees at night. She was found the following day, alive, on the northeast face, 4 miles from the bowl at an elevation of 4,300 feet. She was sitting on a rock, entirely unharmed, staring at the mountain. She said she had no memory of the last 31 hours. When I spoke to her not officially, after the fact, after she'd been medically cleared, I asked her if she'd seen anything in the forest, anything unusual, before she lost her memory of events. She thought about it for a long time. Then she said, there was a light, not a flashlight, lower than that. Low to the ground, like a lantern, but moving through the trees, and I thought someone needed help. She followed the light, she doesn't know what happened after that. I'm not going to speculate about what the light was, or what the watches mean, or who cleared the bowl before I could gather them as evidence. What I know is the number, 17 incidents, 12 on the northeast face, in an elevation band that doesn't appear in any risk assessment or trail safety briefing for Rainier. What I know is that something is curating objects in a forest bowl that has no reason to exist on any map. What I know is that a woman followed a light and lost 31 hours and came back unharmed and doesn't remember anything. What I know is that her watch was the one left in the center of the circle. And I know this. When I drove back to the bowl one more time before filing my final report, I found one new watch in the depression. It was running, it was set to the correct time. Story 6. I'm a park ranger and I regret my community outreach program. The last thing I expected at the end of an 8-week community education program was to have the realization, quietly and with absolute certainty, that one of the 12 participants in my wilderness orientation group was not a person. Here's how I got to that realization. I've been a ranger at Cascades National Forest for 6 years. In my 5th year, I pitched a community outreach initiative to my district supervisor, a program called Forest Familiar, designed to bring local residents who had little or no wilderness experience into the park for structured education sessions. 8 weeks, twice a week, covering trail safety, wildlife awareness, leave no trace principles, basic navigation. The goal was to reduce the number of unprepared visitors we had to extract from the backcountry every summer. My supervisor approved it. I recruited participants through the county community center, the library, and local social media. 12 people signed up, ages ranging from mid-20s to early 70s. A mix of backgrounds, a retired teacher, a college student, a woman who'd recently moved to the area from out of state and wanted to start hiking, a quiet, middle-aged man who said he'd always been curious about the forest but never went in. That last one was the one I need to tell you about. I'm going to call him Harris, because I never confirmed his real name despite thinking I had. Harris attended every session. He was always early, he was always pleasant. He asked thoughtful questions about flora identification and watershed ecology. He took detailed notes by hand in a small notebook. He seemed engaged and interested. The thing I noticed first and dismissed, because I'm predisposed to rationalize, was that Harris didn't sweat. We were doing 2 to 3 miles of moderate terrain in summer heat. Everyone else was flushed and damp by the midpoint. Harris looked the same at the end of a session as he did at the beginning. Cool, neat, comfortable. I told myself he was just fit. The second thing, Harris had no social media presence. I know because another participant, the college student, tried to connect with him after the first session and found nothing. No profile, no account, nothing. She mentioned it to me in passing, laughing a little. He's like a ghost, she said. I didn't attach significance to it at the time. The third thing was a photograph. Week 5. I took group photos at the end of each session for the district's outreach documentation. I photographed the group at a scenic overlook. When I uploaded the photos that evening and reviewed them, Harris was in the group, but not the way everyone else was. Everyone else in the photograph was captured in mid-motion, someone turning, someone gesturing, natural body language. Harris was completely still. And not in the posed way that people stand still for photographs, still in the way that objects are still. No micro movement. Completely symmetric in his posture, both hands at his sides, face forward, eyes open. I went back through the previous week's photos. Same thing in every group shot. Complete stillness, while everyone around him moved. I started paying different attention after that. Week 6, we were doing a session on animal sign identification. I walked the group through a section of trail with abundant track evidence deer, raccoon, a bobcat print from a few days prior. When we reached the bobcat print, I watched the group's faces. Most people were curious or excited. Harris bent down and examined the track for approximately 40 seconds in silence. Then he stood up and said, quietly, "It came through here at 4:17 this morning." The group laughed, assuming he was joking. I wrote down the time. I set a trail camera on that section of trail that evening. The next morning, I reviewed the footage. The camera showed, among the expected deer and raccoon activity, a bobcat moving through the frame at 4:17 a.m. I sat with that for a long time. Week 7. I took the group deeper into the park than I'd planned. An area I knew well, 3 miles from the nearest road, a trail junction that most visitors never reached. When we arrived at the junction, Harris paused and looked down the unmarked track that led into the restricted interior. He said, to no one in particular, "This is where it opens up." I asked him what he meant. He looked at me. He said, "Further in. Things are different further in. You know that already." I didn't respond. We continued the session. At the end of the day, I asked Harris casually how he'd found out about the program. He said he'd seen the flyer at the library. I asked him where he lived. He gave an address on the east side of the county. I drove past it the following Saturday. The address was a vacant lot. Week 8, the final session. I planned a review hike on a well-maintained loop near the visitor center. Harris didn't show up. No message, no explanation. He wasn't there when I called the group's names. He was never there again. I called the number he'd given on his intake form. Disconnected. I asked at the library. No one had any record of the flyer he mentioned, because I'd only posted flyers at the community center and on social media, not at the library. I finished the program with 11 participants. The district rated it a success. I put in the documentation to run it again next spring, but I've been thinking about what Harris said at the junction. You know that already. The way he said it, like we shared a private understanding, like he wasn't coming to learn something from me, but to confirm something about me. I've been thinking about those photographs, that stillness. I've been thinking about the fact that he came 8 weeks in a row into a forest that he seemed to know better than I do, and that he stopped coming on the last week, as if whatever he came to confirm had been confirmed. I keep looking at the intake form, at the name Harris, at the handwriting on it, which is very neat and very consistent. Not the handwriting of someone who writes often, the handwriting of something that practiced it. I'm running the program again in the spring. 12 new participants. I keep thinking there might be a 13th who just shows up. Story 7. I used to be a park ranger, and there are some things people need to know about what's in the forests. The last thing my training supervisor ever said to me before I left the service was this: the forest is not empty. It has never been empty. The only question has always been whether it knows you're there before you know it is. She said it at my exit interview. It was the most honest thing anyone in that job ever said to me. Here's what I need people to know. I worked as a ranger for 11 years across 3 different national forests, 2 in the Pacific Northwest and 1 in the Southern Appalachians. In that time, I accumulated a body of experience that I have never been able to fully reconcile with any official framework I was given for understanding the natural world. I'm not saying what I experienced was supernatural. I'm saying that whatever it was real and it was consistent, and it was never acknowledged by anyone in a position of authority who I believe didn't know exactly what I was describing. The first thing you need to know: There are sounds in old-growth forests that have no documented source. I don't mean wind through trees or unknown bird species. I mean structured sounds, rhythmic, low frequency, sometimes with tonal variation that resembles language. Infrasound, measurable. I recorded some of it. The frequency range was outside normal wildlife vocalization and below the threshold of human speech, but above what most geological processes produce. When I asked a wildlife acoustics researcher I knew about it, she said she'd heard similar recordings from 3 different forest ecosystems and that the research community did not have an agreed explanation. She said this quietly, like she was reporting a personal failure. The second thing, old growth forests have a smell that changes at night in a way that isn't attributable to damp or temperature alone. It becomes heavier, more complex. In my experience, the smell intensifies near specific old trees that are, by measurement, the oldest organisms in the stand. I came to understand, after several years, that the smell intensification correlated with increased animal avoidance behavior in the same areas. Deer, elk, smaller mammals in areas where the smell was strongest, animal sign was absent. No tracks, no scat, no bird activity, as if those areas were deliberately being avoided. I called them silent zones in my private notes. The forests had them. Every forest I worked had them, and they moved. Not quickly, not daily. But over seasons, the silent zones shifted measurable if you tracked them, which I did, moving through the forest interior in patterns I could not predict. The third thing is harder to explain. In my 7th year, I worked a sector in the Cascade Range that contained one of the oldest documented stands of Douglas fir in the American Northwest. Some of those trees were over 900 years old. During a survey of the old-growth core, I began to have what I can only describe as a persistent sensation of being observed, not by an animal, not by another person, by the stand itself. I know how that sounds, I documented it anyway. The sensation was consistent, directional. It always felt as though the attention was coming from a specific quadrant of the stand, changing as I moved, as if tracking me. Other rangers who worked that sector, 3 of them, in different conversations over 2 years, described the same sensation without me prompting it. One of them, a ranger named Dell, who'd worked that sector for 9 years, said he had a rule. He always said something aloud when he entered the old-growth core. Not loudly. Just acknowledged it. Said something like, "I know I'm here and you know I'm here." He said it made the sensation more manageable. I started doing the same thing. He was right. The fourth thing is the one people most need to hear because it's the most actionable. If you are in a forest, any forest, not a special one, just a forest, and you become convinced that there is something watching you that is not an animal, do not run. Do not move quickly at all. Slow your movements. Make yourself visible. If there is a clearing, move toward it. If there is a trail, return to it. Announce your exit, speak aloud, calmly, say you are leaving, say the direction you are heading. I know that sounds like folklore. I am telling you, it works. I have helped recover 9 people from forest disorientation events, people who were not medically impaired, not physically injured, who simply got confused in the backcountry and could not find their way out despite having maps, compasses, trail experience. In 7 of those 9 cases, when I asked them to describe what happened, they described a sensation of being actively disoriented by something that wasn't visible, a feeling of being turned around that was not attributable to conditions, a sound or movement that pulled their attention in the wrong direction repeatedly. In 2 of those cases, the person said they had started running. Dell retired 2 years before I did. His last act before leaving was to walk into the old-growth core alone, spend an hour there, and walk back out. I asked him why. He said he was saying goodbye properly. He said, "You don't just leave without acknowledgement." He said, "The forest notices when you're gone as surely as it notices when you're there." I've been out of the service for 3 years. I still live within an hour of the Cascades. I still go in, but I always say something when I enter the old growth. And I wait for what feels like acknowledgement before I go deeper. Story 8. I was a national park ranger. Here are some of the things I encountered. The last thing I told my replacement before I handed over my sector keys was simple. Keep a separate notebook. Not for the official log, for the other things. Date, location, description, your gut assessment. Keep it. You'll want it. She looked at me like I was joking. I wasn't. Here are some of the things I encountered across 14 years as a national park ranger. Year 1. A hiker came to the visitor center at Great Smoky Mountains National Park with a photograph she'd taken on the Appalachian Trail near a ridge crossing above 4,500 feet. She wanted to know what was in the photograph. The photograph showed the trail ahead of her a long straightaway between rhododendron tunnels. In the middle of the trail, at the edge of clear resolution, was a figure. Upright, thin, tall enough that the perspective scale from the trail markers placed it at well above 6 feet. The figure was facing away from the camera. The hiker said she had not seen the figure when she took the photograph. She had been taking a landscape shot. I told her it was probably another hiker. She said, there were no other hikers on that section that day. The trail register confirmed I was alone. I documented the photograph. It's in my personal archive. Year 3. Near the backcountry boundary in Shenandoah, a deer appeared on a fire road I was patrolling. Standard occurrence, would have filed no note. The unusual thing, the deer stopped in the center of the road and turned to look at me. Not the quick head turn of a spooked deer, a slow rotation. It held eye contact for what I measured by clock as 90 seconds. Then it turned and walked off the road into the tree line without any sign of alarm. I've seen tens of thousands of deer. I'd never had one hold eye contact for 90 seconds. The wildlife biologist I consulted said it was likely a habituated individual accustomed to human presence. She may have been right. But habituated deer don't hold eye contact. They look and then look away. They don't study you. Year 5. A section of the Hazel Creek area in Great Smoky was flagged for a welfare check after a pair of hikers reported hearing crying from off-trail. I went in, found the terrain steep, heavily vegetated, impractical for any casual off-trail movement. No visual sign of distress, no response when I called out. I was about to log it as an acoustic anomaly and clear when I noticed the vegetation had been disturbed in a very specific way, not bent or broken the way an animal or a human moves through undergrowth, but laid flat, as if pressed down, in a corridor about 18 inches wide. The corridor ran straight for approximately 40 meters and then ended. The crying sound on the walk back was gone. Year 6, the one that changed how I worked. I was doing an end-of-season patrol in a section of Glacier National Park near the Canadian border. Remote sector, one trail, low visitor count. I found a camp that had been abandoned. Not emergency abandoned, not gear scattered. The camp had been carefully, methodically struck. Everything folded, packed, stacked, but left there. Not loaded out, as if someone had prepared everything for departure and then not departed. The fire pit was cold, several days at minimum. The packed gear had dew condensation on it, consistent with at least 2 nights of exposure, but the site showed no animal disturbance, none. Bears would have ransacked a food supply in hours. There was food clearly visible inside a poorly secured pack. Nothing had touched it. I searched the perimeter. Half a mile out, I found a single boot, standing upright, unlaced, on a flat rock in the middle of a stream crossing. Just one boot. Standing upright, I filed the report, a search was conducted. The campers, 2 brothers from the Midwest, were found 3 days later near the park's eastern boundary, disoriented but physically unharmed. They had no memory of the last 4 days. The medical team noted they showed no signs of substance use, no head injuries, no medical cause for the memory gap. Year 8. A woman doing a solo thru hike reported a fire on the peak of a summit that had been closed to visitors for 7 years following a rockfall. She had a photograph of it, a clear orange glow at the summit, visible from her camp at the base, at approximately 2 in the morning. I surveyed the summit the following day. There was a fire ring. Recent ash, less than 48 hours old. Footprints around it in the thin soil, enough to suggest 1 person, possibly 2. No permit had been issued for that summit. No maintenance crews had been up there. I never identified who had been on that summit. I also never identified how they'd accessed it, given that the approach routes were gated and the closest alternative involved a technical climb no unregistered group would have been cleared for. Year 11, I found the notebooks. 6 of them, waterproofed, in a dry bag wedged under a rock outcrop in a backcountry zone I was surveying for storm damage. Each notebook was from a different year, spanning 20 years of consistent documentation. The author, no name given, had recorded incidents across the same park I was working in. The incidents were similar in nature to what I'd been logging privately: anomalous animal behavior, unexplained sounds, abandoned camps, visual phenomena at high elevation. The last notebook ended mid-sentence, in the middle of a field entry. The final words were, "It's not that they don't want us to know. It's that they can't explain what knowing would do to." That was where it stopped. I have those notebooks still. I've read them many times. I keep looking for the author's name. There's none. But there are dates and locations, and in the cross-referencing I've done, 3 of the incidents described match events in the official park records that I can access. Those events were logged as anomalous wildlife activity, no follow-up required. In 2 of those 3 cases, the official report was signed by a ranger who retired from the service in 1987. In 1987, the current administration's oldest records show that Ranger was officially listed as deceased duty-related incident. I haven't found a death record. I've looked. Story 9. My father is a park ranger. He took me with him on the night shift. I should have listened to his rules. The last thing my father told me before we got out of the truck that night was 3 rules. You don't wander, you don't call out. And if something calls your name from the tree line, you get back in the truck. You do not answer, no matter what the voice sounds like. I was 15. I thought he was setting up a joke. He wasn't. Here's what happened. My father has been a park ranger for 23 years. He works Pisgah National Forest in western North Carolina ridge country, dense hardwood slopes, old logging roads that dead end into nothing. He doesn't talk about the job at dinner the way I imagined rangers would. He talks about the paperwork, the vehicle maintenance, the occasional hiker extraction. He doesn't talk about the other things. I knew there were other things. I'd grown up adjacent to the job. I'd seen his private notebook, the one he kept separate from the official log, the one he'd sometimes page through with the look on his face that he got when he was trying to work something out. I'd watched him take a call at 2 in the morning and get dressed without explanation and be gone until dawn. I'd heard him tell my mother once, quietly, that some parts of the forest are better left alone. The night he took me was a night my mother was visiting her sister 2 states over. It was late October. He had a patrol shift he couldn't reschedule. He said I could come along, but I had to stay close and I had to follow the rules. He gave me the 3 rules in the truck. Then he said, almost as an addition, and don't count the trees. I asked him what that meant. He said, if you start thinking there are too many trees, like the count doesn't make sense, like there's more than there should be, stop and don't count. Just stop looking and walk toward the truck. He said it the way you say something you've said before, to yourself or to someone else, like it was already a documented procedure. We went into the forest at 10:30. The first 2 hours were ordinary. He was checking on trail closures, logging some animal sign, walking his sector in the efficient, unhurried way he always moved through that environment. I stayed close. I kept the flashlight where he told me to point it. I watched him work. Around midnight, we were on a fire road in the interior when he stopped walking without warning. He put his hand out, and I stopped too. We stood still. Then I heard it from the tree line, about 100 meters to the west, a sound that was almost my name. Not quite. The same number of syllables, the same initial consonant, but slightly wrong. Like a recording with the audio slightly degraded. I started to turn toward the sound. My father's hand came down on my shoulder, and he turned me back to face the road. He didn't say anything. He started walking toward the truck. Not fast, measured, deliberate. The sound came again, closer, unmistakably trying to be my name. My chest pulled toward the tree line like a physical thing, like the sound had a tether on me. My father's hand on my shoulder didn't release. We walked for 4 minutes back to the truck. He unlocked it. I got in. He got in. Doors closed. He started the engine. Then he said, without looking at me, "You heard it." I said yes. He said, "It's been in that sector for 3 years. First time I heard it, it said my name. Now it tries other names. It learns them from." He stopped. He thought about how to finish the sentence. He said, "From contact." I asked him what it was. He was quiet for a while. Then he said the closest thing he had to an answer, which wasn't really an answer, there are things in old forests that pay attention. They don't have our biology. They don't have our limitations. But they want engagement. And the way they try to get it is sound, mimicry. They find something that pulls, and they use it. I asked him why not answering mattered. He said, because once you answer, it knows the signal works. And it will follow the signal. He drove us out of the interior and finished the rest of the patrol from the access roads. On the drive home, I asked him about the counting the trees thing. He took a long time to answer. He said the best way he could explain it was that sometimes the forest is bigger on the inside than it should be. That the geometry stops working properly in certain sections, in certain conditions. That if you notice this, if your brain starts flagging the inconsistency, the right thing is to not engage with it. Just look at the ground and move toward familiar terrain. I asked him if he'd experienced it. He said yes, once, badly. He said he'd stood in a stand of trees at around 2 in the morning and counted 12 trees in a ring around him, and then counted again and got 15, and then counted again and got 9, and that he'd stopped counting after that and walked out with his eyes down and not looked up until he reached the fire road. He said when he looked up, the fire road was a mile closer than it should have been. I'm 22 now. I'm in my first semester of a natural resources program. People in my cohort talk about their reasons for wanting the work conservation, wildlife management, environmental policy. Those are my reasons too. But there's another reason I've never told anyone. I want to understand what's in that sector. I want to understand what learns names from contact. I want to understand why the geometry fails, and why looking away fixes it, and what exactly my father meant when he said, these things don't have our limitations. I want to understand it from a safe distance with proper documentation in full daylight. But I'm also aware that my father has worked that forest for 23 years and he still takes the rules seriously. He gave them to me in the truck like someone giving a 15-year-old the protocol for handling a live wire. Respect first, then understanding. He also never told me what happened the first time he heard his name from the tree line. I asked him once. He said he answered it. He won't tell me what happened after that. He just said, that was the night I started keeping the private notebook. Whatever it told him, whatever it did when he answered, he's been writing it down ever since. Story 10. I kill evil that the government does not want you to know about memoirs of an Army Ranger. The last thing my team sergeant said before we crossed into the quarantine zone was, rules of engagement are standard. Threat assessment is non-standard, and if whatever is in there looks at you like it knows your name, you do not wait for authorization. You end it. 3 months later, I understood what he meant. Here's what I can tell you. I spent 11 years as an Army Ranger. Most of what I did falls under classification levels. I won't pretend to circumvent, not because I'm a rules follower by nature, but because some of what's in those files would change the way you understood the world, and I'm not sure the world is ready for that. What I can tell you about is the category of operation that doesn't fit neatly into any public-facing military framework. The category that sits between special operations and things we don't officially do, we called them containment operations. Not recon, not strike, containment. The difference matters. The first time I was briefed on a containment op, it was 6 months into my 4th deployment. My team was pulled from a forward operating base in a country I won't specify, transported by an unmarked aircraft to a staging area, and briefed by a civilian contractor whose agency affiliation was not disclosed. The briefing covered the objective zone, a section of old-growth forest in the Northern Hemisphere, size classified, in a region with minimal civilian population. The briefing covered what had been observed in the zone over a 6-month surveillance period. The briefing did not use the word entity, it used the word presence. The presence had been designated a threat for 3 reasons. It had disabled 2 surveillance drones through means that were not consistent with electronic warfare. It had caused 3 civilian researchers to experience significant psychological disturbance after unauthorized entry into the zone, 2 of whom required extended clinical care, and it had been observed on thermal imaging as a heat signature that did not match any known organism. We went in with standard loadout and additional equipment that the contractor didn't fully explain, a set of directional audio devices that produced a specific frequency range, and a compound in aerosol form that our medic was briefed on, but that I was not. The zone was forest. Dense, old, silent, in a way that was immediately apparent. No bird sound, no insect sound. No wind movement in the canopy, despite an ambient wind that was measurable at the tree line. Just inside the zone, the silence was total in a way that felt less like absence and more like pressure. We found the first structure at 600 meters in. Similar to what others have described elsewhere, bones, stone, branch, assembled into a vertical form that had no function I could identify. My team didn't stop to examine it. We marked the coordinates and continued. The thermal signature was moving. We tracked it for approximately 90 minutes through the interior, maintaining a 300-meter buffer, before our point man signaled contact. It was ahead of us in a clearing. The thermal image didn't convey scale properly. In person, it was approximately 3 meters in height. Bipedal, proportions that weren't right, limbs too long, movement pattern too smooth, no distinct head structure. It was standing at the far edge of the clearing, and it was motionless. Then it turned. The sensation, when it oriented toward us, was physical, not sound, not light pressure, a compression behind the eyes, a metallic taste, a sudden and absolute certainty that the thing looking at us knew everything about us that mattered. My team sergeant didn't wait. The directional audio device produced its frequency. The thing in the clearing I watched this, I am not speculating, flinched, not a large movement. A small one, precise, like a person reacting to a sound in a frequency range only they can detect. Then it moved, faster than anything that size should move, back into the tree line and was gone. We cleared the zone, we found 2 more structures in the interior, we deployed the aerosol compound in the clearing and at the structure locations. The contractor, when we extracted, said the compound was a deterrent, not a weapon. He said the frequency was a disorientation tool. He said containment operations of this type had a success rate that he characterized as acceptable. I asked him what the target was. He said the best description he was authorized to give was a class of non-human intelligence with territorial characteristics and an ability to affect human perception and psychological function. He said they'd been documented in 9 regions globally. He said all 9 were under some form of monitoring. I asked him if containment meant keeping it in or keeping us out. He said both. I left the service 2 years after that operation. Not because of what I saw in the forest, I'd already integrated that, more or less, because of a document I was shown during my exit processing, by mistake, by a clerk who pulled the wrong file. It was a summary report from a long-running interagency program, classified at the highest level I'd ever seen. The summary covered the 9 regions the contractor had mentioned. One line in that summary has stayed with me. It said, subject populations appear to have been aware of human surveillance for the duration of monitoring. The current assessment is that they have permitted the monitoring to continue. Permitted? They knew we were watching. They've always known, and they let us keep watching, which means they had a reason for it. And whatever that reason is, it's not in any document I ever saw. But I think about that clearing. I think about the moment it turned and looked at us, and I felt it know us. I think about how my team sergeant fired the audio device within seconds and didn't hesitate, and how this thing that was 3 meters tall and moved like water and had been in that forest longer than any human institution on Earth, flinched at the sound the way something flinches when it's inconvenienced. Not threatened, inconvenienced. The operation was classified as a success. I'm not sure the thing in the forest would agree with the classification, but I'm also not sure it cared. That's the part that stays with me. Not what it was, not what it could have done to us. The fact that when my team sergeant hit it with every non-lethal deterrent in our kit, it chose to leave. It chose to leave. It could have stayed. I don't know what that means. I don't know if the 9 regions have reached a conclusion about what that means. I've been out for 2 years and I still don't know, but I sleep with a specific audio file on my phone, the frequency from that device. I've never needed it since I left service. I keep it because knowing it worked once is the closest thing to a guarantee I have. I also keep it because part of me thinks if it let us leave that clearing, if it permitted the monitoring, if it made a choice, then someday it might make a different one, and I want to be ready.